Hi, so my name is JD Bortma and I am a software developer at OpenUp. This title turned out much more lofty and ambitious than I intended. I don't mean that this encompasses all kinds of civic tech projects, and it doesn't address all the challenges you will encounter on civic tech projects. At OpenUp, we are always trying to work as effectively as possible. We've tried many different kinds of projects, different arrangements of people, and skill sets. We each contribute different things based on our background and skill sets. We also try to have regular retrospectives throughout the project's life to reflect as a team and stakeholders, to raise concerns, frustrations, and issues, and then try small changes to how we work and see if they address those problems. What often happens is that the problems go away, perhaps because the change we made sorted it out, perhaps because the team is now aware of it, or just because attention has shifted. To be sustainable and even scale up, we've noticed the need to make the things we do that we believe are key to effective projects more explicit. Only when we are explicit about what we are doing can we be sure to apply those learnings across projects and even validate that those activities are really the things leading to success. So this comes out of that effort of looking at a lot of the things that our gut says we should be doing, or that have brought us peace when we've introduced them. What we're going to cover today is some brief context, what OpenUp does, who we are, what some of our fears and concerns are, then key considerations that we believe should be present in every project. We'll look at our current approach for projects, and we'll do a little practical and look and try using that approach in your projects. And finally, we'll recap. So who is OpenUp and what do we do? Our vision is a South Africa where citizens and government are empowered to thrive collaboratively. Our mission is that OpenUp seeks to empower people and government through data, technology, and innovative thinking to become active agents in creating positive social change. One project called WasiMap tries to make census data easily accessible, easy to understand and find and use, make sense of. It's based on a tool called Census Reporter, and I think the main issue with this project is that there's no clear next step or action that you can take once you understand what's going on with your area. Another project called Municipal Money tries to make fiscal data, government financial data, easily accessible. It shows contact details for the leadership of the municipality, and it has some easy to read indicators, and missing data is treated as data. Basically, we're saying that it's worth knowing that data is missing for a particular municipality for a particular time, because that also tells you something about what's going on at the municipality. And next steps still aren't super clear. There's contact details, but you don't really know what you can expect of people, whether you should be able to expect a response, and what else you can do if they don't respond, for example. Another project called CodeBridge Youth tries to set up youth civic participation groups. We try to meet the youth where they are in their municipality, and we provide an opportunity to upskill. So we provide some training around what civic participation can look like and help them organize and tap into existing processes for participation with governance in the local government. And we do this with the local government in collaboration with them. Another project, it's just called our IDP guide at the moment. IDP is just a term for our planning process. This project is an easy, or hopefully easy to use guide to the local government planning process. It tries to make the participation opportunities really clear and unpack how the legislated planning process works. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but in this form, it still doesn't really show you exact meeting dates. It shows you roughly when in every year there's supposed to be participation opportunities, but it doesn't show you when and where and how you can participate at specific dates for a specific municipality. So how do we define success? We are more upset about not knowing whether something has the intended effect, not knowing why it does not have the intended effect, than we are about not seeing the intended effect. Because by learning as quickly as possible what doesn't work, and perhaps why, we can more quickly move on to try other things that would have the intended effect. To be really honest, we're really bad at this. As much as I say it's fundamental to, or is super important to us. One reason that for that is that it's really easy to get caught up in the concrete everyday objective of the project and just getting people to use it. That we end up focusing on getting something out the door, and we forget to then investigate how much it's being used and how effective it is. So OpenUp in some numbers. These are just a rough average for the past 6 years. We've had on average 12 core team members, sometimes more and sometimes less. We've had this notion of sort of internalized contractors that we've only recently started giving that name. But on average, 3 people at any one time are on contract and working very closely with us for some time. And yeah, in 6 years, we've probably had roughly 60 projects bigger than a one-off quick little data visualization. And that might be one person working about 50% for 2 weeks to 3 people working about 70% for 3 years, and everything in between. Some of our projects are our own and funded by grants we apply for. Some projects are driven by other nonprofits and either funded by grants they receive or that we apply for together. Some projects are with government, where we bid on a contract they are advertising. And we do that when there is an opportunity to do something in line with our vision, but as a standard service supplier winning a tender with government. And the most important statistic of all is roughly $3,500 spent on coffee in the last 6 years. And that's a very rough estimate, but it's a fun one. Next up is our fears. These are some of the things we worry might happen, and most of these have happened on one or more projects, and we don't want to repeat that. We fear that we might do something that already existed, or we do something but it won't get used. We might do something but it doesn't actually solve the user's problem, or we do something that doesn't meet our objective, or we might do something and we might start it and it just gets too expensive, or for some other reason it doesn't get finished. Or we might end up just checking the boxes on a contract we've signed with someone because we're running out of time or money, and we're not actually paying attention to the spirit of the project. And finally, and perhaps the worst one, is just not knowing if anyone is using or succeeding with what we've done. Next up, I'm going to go very rapidly through 15 key considerations, things that we believe should at least be in the back of someone's mind when working on a project. You don't need to remember them, you don't need to catch everything. The important thing is that you notice something that you didn't think of before, that you weren't aware was really quite important. For us, it's still not clear who owns each of these areas. Each team member will have multiple responsibilities, but the first step is just making explicit that these things exist and that they are important. Once I have gone through these considerations, we will zoom out a bit and see how they might be grouped into broad areas of responsibility. It's okay if you use different names for these things. I'd love to hear what I've missed or what names you use for these things. I'd love to learn from your experience. And we might have a gap for that during the presentation, otherwise at the end. What are your key things? So whether the project is, for domain knowledge, whether the project is about government finances or about healthcare, someone has to understand the field. For example, Perhaps our accountant knows how to read annual financial statements. Perhaps we do. But do we understand the consequences for a local government being in a certain financial state? What mechanisms are available to address that? Can we partner with someone who knows if we don't? How will we ensure that we are technically correct and don't misrepresent something subtle but important? Under user research, the people who would be interacting with whatever interventions we implement in a project, we need to have an idea who they are. What are they trying to achieve? What motivates them to take action? And how they and we need to know how they fit into the bigger picture. It's also good to be explicit about the kinds of users your project is not trying to serve. Perhaps because they're just too hard to reach right now, and it would be a distraction from getting something valuable out. So for visual design or aesthetic design, it's not just about your website looking pretty, right? It can build trust in your tool for your users and for your client. It can make interactions with your tool easier. When I talk about tracking requirements, I mean actually writing them down and then keeping them up to date. What is the highest priority user need? What is not clear yet, but might be worth looking at later? It really helps to have something to point to when discussing a user need. Somewhere you can clarify what we mean by this need. Where you can write a note. And who is responsible for keeping these up to date? Who is responsible for having the final say in what the scope is of a certain feature, or what the priority is between two features? Administration for me is this mind-numbingly tedious thing, but when you realize how it enables the project and the organization to work effectively and sustainably, it becomes a cog in a pretty interesting machine. It blew my mind when I learned that it can be really problematic if you underspend on a project. It's not just overspending to watch out for. In management accounting, they say you can't manage what you can't measure. So if you're not measuring things like the money available or time spent each month, you're probably not managing that money effectively. While we try to focus 110% on the spirit of the problem we're looking to address and what would be useful to actual users, you still need to adhere to any contracts on the project and legal requirements relevant to the project, and internal processes of good governance. Someone has to create content. Unless you're lucky enough to be able to just copy it from somewhere else and use it directly, someone has to do research and find the structure and compose that into content that fits together. Someone has to gather the correct links to additional resources and put them in the right place. Someone has to condense information to the right length. Someone has to write a video script, for example. Is this going to be the domain expert or a researcher? Is your programmer good at that? What will be the most cost-effective way to get your content? There's also more to publishing information than the words. There's how you use visuals along with the words. There are things very particular to each medium. In this example, I show a government website that is incredibly rich resource, but for the same reason it doesn't show up for some reason it doesn't show up in Google search. If you're making a video, someone needs to think how you tell a story with it. If you're using the web, you need someone who understands publishing to the web. If you're making a video, someone needs to think how to tell a story with that medium. It's the same for making a booklet. You have to write for the user. You have to use language that the user will understand. In this screenshot, the national government wrote Section 32, referring to a section of an act which specifies in-year public reporting requirements. How many people know that Section 32 refers to? So how effective can this public reporting be if no one can find it? You want to catch your audience's eye with what they're looking for, what they expect to see. You don't want to scare them away. At the same time, a lot of the time with civic tech work, the user will eventually have to use a technical term in their engagement with government. So you can't act like the technical term doesn't exist. You might need to find a way to make a connection between the technical term and common language for the concept. Also, If you're trying to help the more specialized audience with the same tool, you should be careful that it isn't so basic that they think it isn't relevant to them. You need to be consistent on your site. Make a decision. Are you using technical terms? Are you using common language? And what is the system you're using to help the user connect the two? For us, technical leadership is exploring how technology can help address a problem. And also when no code or even non-tech things might be more appropriate. And we need to be aware of the hidden costs of writing code and using a lot of technology. Bad decisions can have a significant cost. In industry, a fairly junior team is often given a massive amount of space to try and learn. But for us, doing many small experimental projects, this has proven unaffordable. So we really prioritize having some senior technical person help make decisions in every team. They also understand the hidden and the long-term costs and the efforts needed to keep something running for a long time, better than junior people typically would. Of course, if you decide to build something new, someone has to build it. Someone will probably have to talk to users if you have a community and keep in touch to some extent. Is your software developer able to relate with the intended audience? Who in your team has the time to do this? If you open that door, there's a risk of putting people off if you don't respond. You can and should check with potential or actual users whether you're on the right track at every stage of the process. You want to be doing this to discover that you're probably not on the right track, that you're making incorrect assumptions as early as possible and minimize waste. Finally, someone has to ensure that all these things are considered in the project context. Someone has to hold the vision and relate the vision to the reality of how much money and time is available. Someone has to make overarching decisions of how to get to the vision. Someone should care that all information and various pieces of a project are consistent, and that the project evolves in a way that different pieces don't become disjointed. There are a lot of considerations. We certainly don't have one person per thing. We certainly are not experts in all of them. But when we are explicit about the fact that these things are important to a project, we can see more easily where the gaps are. When I tried to group these considerations into something that makes sense to me, where I would go and ask someone to take care of the issue, these are roughly the groups I came up with. The headings were added after the groups took shape. It doesn't matter if you would group things differently. In reality, when we have a team of 2.5 people, the responsibility for these considerations float around a bit. But it helps us to start thinking about who would wear a certain hat and who we need to bring into a project, or any skills we need to learn ourselves in the team. So what's happened to us a lot is that we would stick a developer on a project, thinking this is a smart person, they'll figure it out. The shading represents the neglect of these considerations. I made the project definition, user experience, and visual design a bit softer than the non-tech and project management crosses, because like shading, because I like to consider myself a well-rounded developer. But it's really, really hard to switch between the big picture, bringing it all together and deciding how to structure the data in the database, how to connect this system to that in a robust way, how to handle missing data. I also made the shade across the visual design a bit smaller, since there are tools we non-visual developers can use to make things look pretty without knowing much about design. But it's still pretty bad if you don't have someone who really understands design. If you add a project manager to the mix, at least that stuff should be taken care of. And now someone is able to hold the big picture, while the techie is deep in the details. It's much better, but there are still big gaps. The name we give the person responsible for the project vision, bringing everything together, defining the project, is the product owner. The term comes from the Scrum methodology, which is usually about software products, but really it can be applied to any kind of project. I'll talk more about the role in Scrum in a moment. The product owner might be the project manager, but they probably shouldn't be part of the implementing team. Adding a product owner, you should see more attention coming to the remaining considerations. But unless they possess those skills and sufficient time, those considerations are not completely solved until they're delegated to someone competent. I will touch more on the Scrum methodology at the end, but I want to touch on the fundamentals of what a product owner is. Someone on your team might already be doing these things. We find it helpful to have a name for it. You don't have to be building a product. The role is about defining the vision of a project, what you want to achieve, understanding the problem space, and making decisions that maximize the value of work done. That's it. So it applies very much to the civic tech space. And I know this role exists in other spaces as well. We use Scrum because it brings some great approaches for working and communicating effectively inside the team and with other stakeholders. There's usually a range of other non-tech implementation work. Researchers and journalists have contributed a lot to our projects. We haven't really had explicit community managers, but we are beginning to do that a little bit and learning what's needed there. The person who truly understands user experience is often called a user experience designer. We have only brought someone like that into a project on a few occasions, sometimes because we had fairly good coverage of that role in the team, and sometimes just out of neglect. On occasion, we've realized quite late that there isn't any awareness in the team of this field and that someone has to pay attention to it until quite late in the project. What are some of the considerations or roles that I'm missing out here from your experience? Can you name, for example, like the word consideration and a short name for it or a short phrase? And the same for roles. What are some roles? Just say role and the role name or a description of it. So again, these are a lot of considerations and a lot of roles. We certainly don't have one person for each one. We are certainly not experts in all of them. But when we are explicit about the fact that these things are important to a project, we can see more easily where the gaps are. Next, we're going to look at our approach to projects. The dark blue represents steps in the process. I just made up these names as I've been discussing this with my colleagues and trying to document it. There are probably better terms for this, and you're welcome to tell me so later. This process chart was derived, not invented. It very much represents our standardized approaches to project standardized approaches to project management. I'm just using it as a vehicle to discuss how these things fit together. The lighter boxes represent outputs or artifacts, things that we produce that we or users can use. I won't go into the detail of how each one is produced. Please Google them. They are actually technical terms used in the software and user experience design space. On the next slide, I do have some questions that help explore these areas a little bit. The rough idea here is that you start with clearly identifying the idea here is that you start with identifying the intended outcome. You define a project vision and set objectives. You then look at the people that are involved or affected by this vision. Potential users, decision makers, data owners. Next, you want to understand the state of the world. What already exists to address this problem? What can you build on? At the same time, and perhaps in conjunction, you can consider how users could succeed. What mechanisms exist to effect change? Finally, you can build something or try doing something, some basic version of your intervention, and see how well that works. And see if you need to adjust your ideas a bit and try again, or if you can scale up. And I don't mean to say you are only speaking to end users at this evaluation step. You should also be validating your ideas with people in the real world. So you should be talking to your clients as well, because they can help you understand if you've misunderstood something, for example. But fundamentally, you should be validating your ideas with people in the real world, outside your bubble, all along this process. It's also okay to go back and update these early stages as you learn. But you should especially have a strong loop of building something small, getting it out to real world users, learning, and building on top of that, on and on and on. The point here is that it's worth doing some homework first, giving your project a nice foundation to build on, so you don't have to ask these questions in every build and evaluation iteration. I want to go through these questions quickly because they're helpful in a project. I also understand, and they're also helpful to understand what we mean by each step. So under intended outcome, we want to look at what we want to achieve. What do we think? Why do we think our idea will achieve that? Should we help our client at with this stage? If there's a client coming to us with an idea, should we help them answer these questions, or do they have it in hand? Under who's involved, you want to ask questions like, what motivates your users? What tools do they use? What do they know already? How educated are they? When looking at the state of the world, you might ask, what data is available and ready to use? What information is out there already? What mechanisms exist? Under how users could succeed, you might ask, where are your users located? How do they find our work, our intervention? How do they get in touch with that? What are all the steps involved in reaching success for the user? When you're building and trying your intervention, what is the smallest thing we could do to validate our idea? What is the core of this feature? What can wait until later? And when you're evaluating that, what do you might ask users, what do you understand from what you see here? What do you not understand from what you see here? When you show them something, perhaps a mock-up of an app, or your actual app, or tool, or a project or a mechanism that you're proposing people use. But you really want to know, what have you misunderstood? Of course, the degree to which we do this and prepare all of these artifacts depends very much on the scale of a project. For a 2-week project, it might be some notes and or sketches. You can treat each artifact like a heading in a document. For a 2-year project, each deliverable might make more sense as one or more document, documenting background, methodology, and perhaps presented in a visually accessible way for the team to easily use for reference. If you come from the NGO or project management world, this probably isn't new to you. It aligns very well with the vision, mission, objectives, outcomes, and activities approach, but with a very clear notion of iteration at this implementation and evaluation stage. So, don't think the scope of this process is just your app idea or just your website idea. I want to quickly introduce storyboarding, one of the methods and the artifacts that could be produced along this process to nail this issue on scope. What's the scope? Like what's the scope of what we have in mind when we're using this process? So here we have a storyboard of our local government finance project. Let's go through the frames quickly. The person is sad here. The water is undrinkable. They're just an everyday citizen. They ask themselves what they're paying for, so they search online for water budget and their city name, and they find, let's say, our website, that presents financial data on water infrastructure spending, as well as contact details of the political representatives. That person got in contact with an elected official who raises the issue in a council meeting, showing the unspent water budget. That leads to the water infrastructure maintenance being prioritized and repaired. And in the end, water is safe to drink again. So a storyboard like this, so that pretty much covers the scope, and we're going to, and I'll quickly explain how storyboards work as well, just to highlight this. You start at a trigger event. The water is undrinkable. This is the space where the user is experiencing a problem. You end with a positive outcome, where water is drinkable again. The issue of water infrastructure, if you work your way back a little bit from the end, the issue is that water infrastructure is in disrepair, and it's fixing that needs to happen for the outcome to be reached. So our intervention here, the budget and spending data can show there is money allocated, but not being spent. The database of local public officials and elected political representatives can show who could be petitioned about the issue. And then an elected official now has the data in hand and can raise the issue and get to the bottom of the underspending and disrepair problem. And don't forget, think about how users will get in contact with your intervention. This depends on who you are targeting. If it's a web thing, you might need to use terms that will lead users to your site via search engines or their networks. So using this process chart then, you can plot the project budget over time and see that talking and asking questions and doing research does cost a bit of time and money. The line goes down a little bit. We can also see that over a number of iterations of building and maybe even evaluating, that also costs time and money. And we show a compressed timescale here where you might do many of these iterations. This is pretty simple stuff. If you forget evaluation, but your budget keeps going down while you're just in this building and building and building loop, and building iteratively is good, but building without evaluation has its problems. You might think at some point, you might get to the end of the project and think, let's evaluate. Now you're doing this when your time and your budget is finished. You can't improve on it anymore. Learning and improvements that come out of this evaluation have to be applied in a different project or a second phase. A lot of the time, we want to jump right into building something. You have a client. If you have a client, people get so wound up getting contracts written and agreed and signed, and clients ask, when can you do something, get something done? So you start making promises about getting something done in the next few weeks. I've been there. I did that just the other day. Don't forget, the deliverables of the earlier steps are completely valid deliverables. If you write them down clearly and make them easy to find and understand, they are tangible deliverables that are laying the foundation for working effectively for the remainder of the project. Treat them that way. Let your partners or your clients see them that way. Don't feel pressure to skip this step and dive into building something that you don't understand the point of yet. If you skipped over all of this initial stuff and you only realize you need it in a few months in, you've got this big jump back, and a lot of budget is already spent on building stuff up to the point where you realize, actually, we do need to define our project clearly. Also, if you didn't write things down very well, or you didn't hand it over as team members changed, people forget what was said in a workshop 6 months ago. So write it down, print it, put it on the wall, This is the foundation of your project. I want to look at an example project quickly. Again, this municipal financial portal. So the intended outcome, we've clarified now, is residents know what their taxes should be and what they are spent on. The people involved are fundamentally the people who live there. It's their money. The state of the world is that there's financial data available. You could use financial indicators to understand within norms how things are going. And you've got a database of public officials and politicians. The way users can succeed is through existing participation processes and via their political representatives and via lobbying. So what we built was a local government financial portal. It shows contact details and varying levels of detail of that financial data and indicators. Our only real kind of evaluation of the portal is that we get CC'd in emails that people send to their representatives and their officials. So we have a sense of what people are using the site for and so on, but that isn't being consolidated and reviewed and analyzed as well as it could be. So a few years after we built this, there's a new phase of the project. We're working on a new feature called Metro Focus, which is as vague to you, to me, as it is to you. Someone wants to look at what sets the major cities apart from the rest of the country. We know there's performance data available for the metropolitan municipalities in the country. That's exciting data. We have some researchers explore what you can tell from this data. What makes metropolitan municipalities different from others? They provide a really interesting analysis. We've built some little indicators and charts to present the data using some designs from another project to save effort. We just need to think about how to present the output from the researchers. Is it just a big document? Is it going to be perhaps slightly more interactive page? Someone asks the question, who is interested in this information? What can they do with it? Will they understand the significance of it? We're presenting this, are we presenting this information to a person of average education level or to an expert? Are we talking about 20% of the population or 0.1% of the population? How much effort should we really put into this feature? And what happened was we kind of lost track of this early stuff and we dove right into building. So then we start to think back, who are the personas again? Did we have personas for this project? What's the overarching goal of the project? While this sort of identity crisis is scary, as we go through these early steps, we can actually end up feeling more confident and less stressed than when we started. So let's try plotting fear. Let's plot fear for a project where you only evaluate at the end first. At the start of the project, the team might have medium fear, a bit of apprehension or skepticism. Of course, this is an average for the team. As you go along learning about the problem space, you gain confidence. You fear the unknown and you're confident when you know stuff. Then you start putting things out there. You work and work and work. If you don't assess how well you're doing and you just keep working, this fear builds up. Think back to that list of fears at the start. Is anyone using it? Are they using it but not actually changing the world in any real way? Is our energy going to waste? If we evaluate regularly, we can have these little short steps of building something, excitement, apprehension, get feedback, and that helps you course correct, showing whether you're on track or not. Even if the feedback is that your tool isn't being used or that you've missed something really important. Now that you know where to focus your energy, and you'll know soon enough you'll see, you'll evaluate again, and you'll see whether you've actually improved matters now that you've responded to that previous feedback. So you can actually bound your team's fear and worries this way. I'm not going to go into how to do user testing. That's a really big subject, and there's a lot of material on it on YouTube, blogs, books, and courses. Something I do want to touch on is how much user testing you should do. User testing generates a massive amount of data. You can quickly be overwhelmed and have more than you'll ever be able to use. So work smart. While you're thinking about how to make your testing representative, keep focus of what questions you want answered. Even a little bit of testing, a few people here and there, can teach you a lot. You don't have to interview 100 people every 2 weeks. And you probably shouldn't, because you'd need a massive and very effective team to put it to good effect. I just want to give a quick example of some conversations that came out of one of our recent attempts at bringing testing back into our process. We're building this tool to help people understand the local government planning process. We think it looks awesome, but we realize we've done a lot of work without speaking to users. So we start speaking to users. One of the things that stand out is that some people are unable to find when and where the actual opportunities for participation are. We thought we won't be able to get that information, so we just carried on with unpacking the process. But actually, hearing users raise this problem, you have to look at this Venn diagram. There are some users who are able to find out when and where opportunities for feedback are. Then there are users, and let's assume that our tool makes it easy to understand the process and draft plans, and people can make informed comment that would actually be taken into account because it speaks to the draft plans and the financial reality of the municipality. If our tool doesn't make it easier to find these opportunities, the number of people that will be participating effectively as a result of our tool is actually very few. Perhaps their input would have been totally okay without our guide, if we only spent our time focused on helping them find when and where those opportunities are, and spent less time on unpacking how the process works. But then we noticed another issue. The participation events were actually part of the strategy. The data of when those actual events are. The idea wasn't that this tool would just be put online and left there. The idea was that it would be something we could offer to municipalities to make part of their participation efforts. They could embed it on their website or link to it. If a municipality is fundamentally part of where this tool is deployed, we can totally assume that we can get access to the data of when those actual events are, which means the actual participation events should really be part of the tool and get the appropriate amount of emphasis in the interface. User testing has not just shown us where we are focusing on the wrong place, but also started a discussion that took us back to the strategy that will enable what the users want. That strategy was there originally, but it just wasn't handed over. So it showed up another problem in our process. Next up, we're going to try the approach on your projects. And perhaps I should pause briefly for questions, and I'll show the structure in a moment. So we will assign you to groups, and you will get an invitation to join a breakout room with a room number. I will show some short URLs for each room's workspace, which will be a Google slide that you can all open and edit collaboratively. Please introduce yourselves and perhaps give the group an idea of which roles or considerations you represent in your organization or your projects. This is what the workspace looks like, the slide that that each group will work on. Use these questions that I've added here, but also help each other. because I'm sure you all have relevant experience on at least some of these areas. And then just edit these boxes, oops, to place some answers in there. You can also use the notes or something. And I think the best feedback to get when you rejoin is these questions. What stood out most from the exercise? Did you identify any gaps in your project foundation? Did you have any new concerns about your project? Do you have any new confidence in your project? And are you planning on changing anything? It depends a bit on how much time we have. If we have time, we'll actually go through your actual answers as well. So yeah, I'll just pause here and see if anyone has questions on this process. These are the URLs, and they'll only be available and working for the summit, and then we will lock them for editing. Oh, and I've crossed these two out because I made a mistake when creating these links. So just use, for group 2, please use C and D. So I would really like to hear from you if you think we're seriously misguided or that we're leading people away from a path of, like a good, safe path. So during the question time, please raise that. Finally, let's recap. We looked at a lot of important considerations. Whether a project has one person or two, someone should be thinking of each of these. Which of these areas are you neglecting? Who can fill that gap? Do you need to bring someone in? Can someone learn a new skill? And there is no new thing under the sun, right? Often talking about the needs and considerations of roles in a very abstract sense. You don't have to invent the actual concrete practices. This is the essence of the standard way of working in the software industry, called Agile. Agile is a set of principles. It's derived from the commonalities between projects that were successful. It does not mean you change direction all the time. It means you're trying and learning all the time. Scrum is a methodology for applying the Agile principles in your project. As humans, we tend to be bad at handling the sort of complexity that is common in any software project, but especially in civic technology. Methodologies like Scrum bring tools, procedures, and practices that help deal with our human nature, to identify assumptions, to document our decisions in easy ways that don't add a massive administrative burden. Agile can work very well with government procurement and projects that need especially tight control. It's worth having a clear way of helping administrators and decision makers in government map the Agile way of working to supply chain management processes and oversight. They might not understand the connection immediately, so try and have those things ready when discussing with them. Being able to talk about the artifacts generated, like minuted decisions made by the client in planning meetings, prioritization of features by the client, is really helpful in helping people in government understand that the flexibility to adapt scope as you learn does not mean taking an additional risk. And I want to make a note on fixed scope and variable cost. Scope is a thing we don't understand. So one way of saying this is fixed cost, variable scope, says we recognize that we don't really know what exactly we can achieve. What we know is which direction we want to go in. With this much money we have this much money available. There's rarely a blank check with government. At least there shouldn't be. We're going to make the best impact we can, and we're going to learn as much as possible with that money. Finally, I'd really like to acknowledge Peter Kuhn of Pondo.co and Jennifer Walker. They've both been incredibly helpful for me to learn about user experience design and just putting a process like this together. And Code for All, thank you for this opportunity. And to my colleagues who I've bored to tears talking about all of these things for the last 4 years, thank you very much. Finally, feel free to use this. It's licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 international license.